The punch that changed everything. Racist cop targets. Trump's hidden soldier. The sun dips low over Kansas City. The streets are busy with workers heading home, teenagers riding bikes, and small groups gathering at corner stores. Among them walks Deshaun Miller, a 25-year-old black man, wearing a worn hoodie with the words "Hidden Soldier" stitched across the chest. His face is calm but focused. He's heading home after a long day at the construction site. Officer Kyle Turner, a white police officer in his mid-40s, sits in his patrol car parked across the street. He notices Deshaun, his eyes narrowing as he grips the wheel tightly. Kyle has been with the force for 18 years, and in his mind, he's seen enough to know trouble when he sees it. Kyle steps out of the car, adjusting his belt. "Hey you, stop right there," he calls out. Deshaun slows but doesn't stop entirely. "You talking to me?" he asks, turning around. "Yeah, I'm talking to you. What are you doing here?" Kyle's voice is sharp, suspicious. Deshaun frowns, holding up his lunchbox. "Coming home from work, man. What's the problem?" Kyle walks closer, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Don't get smart with me. You look out of place. Got some ID?" Deshaun sighs, reaching into his back pocket for his wallet. "Man, I live 3 blocks away. I ain't done nothing wrong." A few bystanders start to notice the interaction. One of them, Rachel, a middle-aged black woman carrying groceries, stops and watches nervously. Deshaun hands Kyle his ID, but the officer barely glances at it. "Hidden soldier, huh?" he says, tapping the words on Deshaun's hoodie. "What's that supposed to mean? You one of those anti-American types?" Deshaun exhales, trying to stay calm. "It's just a nickname. Ain't got nothing to do with you." Kyle steps closer, now invading Deshaun's personal space. "I don't like your tone. Hands where I can see them." Rachel calls out, "Leave him alone. He's just walking home." "Ma'am, stay out of this," Kyle snaps, not breaking eye contact with Deshaun. Deshaun's voice rises slightly. "Why you gotta be like this, man? I ain't done nothing wrong." "You want to make this difficult?" Kyle retorts, his voice hard. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "For what?" Deshaun's frustration boils over. "You don't even have a reason." The tension explodes. Kyle's patience snaps, and without warning, he swings his fist. The punch lands on Deshaun's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. A collective gasp echoes from the growing crowd. Deshaun steadies himself, his hand clutching his face. "You just hit me? For nothing?" His voice cracks with a mix of pain and disbelief. Rachel, now recording on her phone, yells, "We saw that! You had no right!" Kyle, realizing the crowd is watching, steps back, but maintains his composure. "He was resisting arrest," he barks, pulling out his radio. "Need backup on East 14th Street. Deshaun glares at him, his chest heaving. "This is what you do? This is who you are?" Within hours, the video Rachel recorded spreads like wildfire on social media. The hashtags, "Justice for Deshaun" and "Racist Cop," trend nationwide. News outlets pick up the story, showing the punch on repeat. Deshaun sits in his small apartment that evening, his jaw bruised, his mind racing. His mother, Elaine, sits beside him, holding his hand. "I don't want you going back out there," Elaine says, her voice trembling. "They'll find another excuse to hurt you." Deshaun shakes his head. "Ma, I can't stay quiet. This ain't just about me. How many times has this happened to someone else?" Elaine looks at him, her eyes filled with worry. "And how many of them are still here to tell their story?" Meanwhile, Kyle sits in his own living room, his wife, Deborah, pacing nervously. "They're saying you're a racist, Kyle," she exclaims. "This video is everywhere." Kyle defends himself, though his voice lacks conviction. "I was doing my job. He looked suspicious." Deborah stops, glaring at him. "Suspicious because he's black. Is that what you mean?" Kyle falls silent, staring at the television replaying the punch. Deep down, He begins to question himself, but his pride won't let him admit it. Protests erupt in Kansas City and beyond. Crowds chant, "No justice, no peace," and hold signs bearing Deshawn's name. Community leaders and activists demand Kyle's resignation, while police unions argue he acted within protocol. Months later, the trial begins. Deshawn testifies, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've lived my whole life trying to follow the rules, trying to survive in a system that doesn't see me as human. That day, I was just a man walking home, but to him, I was a threat." Kyle sits silently, his face pale. For the first time, he realizes the weight of his actions. The jury convicts him of assault, a rare moment of accountability in cases like this. Deshawn becomes a symbol of resilience, using his platform to speak about police reform and systemic racism. "That punch hurt," he tells a crowd during a rally, "but it woke up a lot of people. Maybe now we can start to fix this." As for Kyle, he struggles to rebuild his life. He attends mandatory bias training and begins volunteering in marginalized communities. Though many question his sincerity, he quietly admits to himself, "I was wrong." The story doesn't end with a perfect resolution. The scars of racism in America run deep, and one trial cannot erase centuries of injustice. But for Deshawn and his community, the punch that changed everything becomes a rallying cry, a reminder that the fight for equality is far from over. And as the crowd disperses after another day of protests, Deshawn stands tall, his hoodie still bearing the words, "Hidden Soldier." Only now, everyone knows what it means. The days after the punch are a whirlwind. The small neighborhood where Deshawn lives becomes the epicenter of a national conversation. News vans line the streets, activists flood in, and neighbors begin organizing marches and community meetings. Deshawn, initially reluctant, is thrust into the spotlight. One of the key organizers, Pastor Jeremiah Harris, addresses a growing crowd in a church packed to capacity. His deep, resonant voice carries through the sanctuary. Brothers and sisters, what happened to Deshawn is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a disease that has plagued this nation for far too long. Racism is a sickness, and we are here not just to treat the symptoms, but to fight for a cure. The crowd erupts in applause, and Deshawn, sitting quietly in the back, feels a wave of emotion. He never intended to be a symbol, but now he understands that this moment is bigger than himself. While the community rallies, Kyle Turner faces mounting pressure. Suspended from duty and shunned by many of his peers, he begins to unravel. He spends nights replaying the video in his mind, the punch a sharp reminder of his own anger and fear. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Kyle speaks to his partner and closest friend on the force, Officer Dan Mitchell. "I didn't think, Dan," Kyle admits, staring at his coffee cup in a dingy diner. "I just acted, but now I'm wondering, why? Was it because of the hoodie? The way he looked? The way I was raised?" Dan, a white officer with a more nuanced view, leans forward. "Kyle, we've been trained to see danger everywhere. But what you did wasn't training, it was bias. You've got to face that." Kyle bristles at first, but knows Dan is right. For the first time, Kyle considers that his actions weren't just a mistake. They were part of a systemic problem he's been blind to for years. Meanwhile, Deshawn struggles with his new role as a community leader. One night, as he sits on his porch, his longtime friend Tyrone joins him. "You really gonna let them turn you into some kind of poster boy?" Tyrone asks, lighting a cigarette. "Man, you didn't sign up for this." Deshawn nods. "I didn't. But Tyrone, what if it's what I'm supposed to do? My grandma used to say, 'God don't give you battles you can't handle.' Maybe this is mine." Tyrone shakes his head. "You're braver than me, man. I just want to forget it ever happened." "I can't forget," Deshawn says, his voice firm. "If I stay quiet, nothing changes." When the trial begins, The courtroom becomes a stage for America's deepest racial divisions. The prosecution presents the video of the punch, highlighting Kyle's aggressive behavior and lack of justification. The defense, however, leans on fear, arguing that Kyle acted out of concern for his safety. Deshawn takes the stand. His voice is steady, but his hands tremble as he recounts the incident. "I'm tired of living like this," he says, his eyes scanning the courtroom. "Tired of feeling like my skin makes me guilty. I wasn't a threat. I was just a man trying to get home." Kyle listens, his jaw clenched. For the first time, he feels the weight of Deshawn's humanity. The man he punched isn't just a suspect. He's a person with a life, a family, and dreams. When Kyle testifies, he falters. "I thought I was doing my job," he says, his voice cracking. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I saw a threat where there wasn't one." After days of deliberation, the jury returns a verdict, guilty of assault. The decision sends shockwaves through the nation. For some, it's a rare victory in the fight against police brutality. For others, it's proof that officers are being unfairly targeted. Deshawn doesn't celebrate. Instead, he focuses on what comes next. "This isn't about punishing one man," he tells reporters outside the courthouse. "It's about changing a system that's broken." The punch becomes a turning point, not just for Deshawn and Kyle, but for the nation. Conversations about race and policing intensify. Activists push for new laws requiring de-escalation training and stricter accountability for officers. Some cities begin implementing community oversight boards, giving citizens a voice in police conduct. But progress is slow. Opposition arises from police unions, conservative pundits, and politicians who frame the reforms as anti-law enforcement. After serving a short sentence, Kyle dedicates himself to understanding the system he once defended. He attends seminars on racial bias, volunteers in black communities, and even reaches out to Deshawn. Their first meeting is tense, but over time they begin to find common ground. "You'll never understand what it's like to be me," Deshawn tells Kyle during one meeting. "But if you're serious about changing, then maybe we can start with that." Kyle nods, humbled. "I'm trying, Deshawn. I don't know if it's enough, but I'm trying." As months turn into years, Deshawn becomes a powerful voice for change. He helps establish a nonprofit called Hidden Soldiers, dedicated to empowering marginalized communities and advocating for police reform. His story inspires others to speak out, creating a ripple effect across the nation. During one speech at a national rally, Deshawn stands before a crowd of thousands. "That punch changed my life," he says, "but it didn't break me. It woke me up, and now I'm here to wake up the rest of this country." The punch that changed everything becomes a pivotal moment in America's ongoing struggle with racism and justice. While the scars of that day remain, they serve as a reminder of the work still left to do. Deshawn's hoodie, once a simple piece of clothing, now hangs in a civil rights museum, a symbol of resilience and the fight for equality. And as he continues his work, he carries the hope that one day no one will have to be a hidden soldier in the battle for basic human dignity. The story doesn't end with perfection, but it ends with purpose. And for Deshawn, that's enough to keep fighting. The story of the punch that changed everything takes on a life of its own. Deshawn's name becomes a rallying cry, not just in Kansas City, but across the nation. Cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles see protests organized under the banner of Hidden Soldiers. The phrase takes on new meaning, a movement of ordinary people standing against systemic racism, inspired by Deshawn's resilience. Deshawn is invited to speak at colleges, community centers, and even congressional hearings. At one such event in Washington, D.C., he addresses a room full of lawmakers, activists, and police reform advocates. "I'm not here to vilify anyone," Deshawn says, standing at the podium, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to say this: accountability is not an attack on law enforcement. It's a demand for justice, and justice doesn't pick sides based on skin color. Kyle Turner's life takes a drastically different turn. After losing his job and serving his sentence, he relocates to a smaller town, away from the public eye. But the events of that day continue to haunt him. Every news report about police violence, every protest chant, brings him back to the moment he threw that punch. He begins attending community forums, often sitting quietly in the back. At one event, a black pastor, Reverend Margaret Lee, recognizes him. Instead of confronting him, she approaches him afterward. "Officer Turner," she says, her voice gentle but firm, "you've made mistakes, but what are you going to do about them now?" Kyle hesitates, but finally speaks. "I want to understand. I want to make it right, but I don't know where to start." Reverend Lee smiles. "You start by listening." Kyle becomes a regular at Reverend Lee's church meetings, where he hears stories from black residents about their experiences with law enforcement. Slowly, he begins to see the world from their perspective. It's a painful process, but it's also transformative. As the movement grows, other incidents come to light. Inspired by Deshawn's courage, people across the country share their own stories of racial profiling and police brutality. One such story comes from Maria Sanchez, a Latina mother whose teenage son was wrongly detained and beaten by police in Arizona. "I saw Deshawn on the news," Maria says during a televised interview, "and I thought, if he can stand up, so can we." Maria's story adds another layer to the movement, highlighting the intersectionality of racial injustice in America. Hidden Soldiers becomes a coalition of Black, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous communities fighting for systemic change. Not everyone supports the movement. Conservative media outlets accuse Deshawn of playing the victim and label Hidden Soldiers as anti-police. Political pundits debate endlessly on television, with one side calling for sweeping reforms and the other defending the status quo. In Kansas City, a counter-protest emerges, led by a group of local business owners and off-duty officers who argue that the police are being unfairly demonized. Their signs read, "Support the Blue," and "Cops are heroes too." The tension escalates, with heated exchanges between protesters and counter-protesters. During one such confrontation, Deshawn steps in to de-escalate. Standing between the two groups, he raises his hands and speaks directly to the counter-protesters. "Listen, this isn't about hating the police," he says, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about making sure everyone is treated fairly. That's something we should all want, right?" His words don't dissolve the tension entirely, but they plant seeds of doubt in some. A few counter-protesters lower their signs and walk away, deep in thought. Deshawn's story continues to dominate headlines. News outlets dig into his past, searching for any detail to either elevate or discredit him. They find a minor misdemeanor from his teenage years, a shoplifting charge for stealing a candy bar. Some use it to paint him as a criminal, while others argue it highlights the systemic issues young black men face. In an interview on a major network, Deshawn addresses the scrutiny head-on. "I was a kid who made a dumb mistake," he says. "But why does that mistake define me more than the good I've tried to do since? Why does it feel like, for people like me, one wrong step means we're guilty forever?" The interview goes viral, sparking a broader conversation about the criminal justice system and the lifelong stigma it places on marginalized communities. Amid the growing movement, unexpected allies emerge. One of them is Sarah Whitaker, a white teacher from rural Iowa who starts a fundraising campaign for Hidden Soldiers. Her initiative raises over $200,000, much of it from small-town donors who say they want to support real change. Sarah becomes a prominent figure in the movement, using her platform to educate others about privilege and systemic inequality. In one heartfelt post, she writes, "Deshawn's story opened my eyes to a reality I'd been blind to. It's not enough to say, 'I'm not racist.' We have to actively work against racism in all its forms." Her words resonate, inspiring others to take action in their own communities. Months later, Deshawn and Kyle meet face to face for the first time since the incident. It happens during a community event organized by Reverend Lee, who believes healing can only happen through dialogue. The room is tense as they sit across from each other. Deshawn looks at Kyle, his expression unreadable. Kyle speaks first. "I've spent every day since that punch trying to understand why I did what I did, and I can't undo it. But I want to say I'm sorry." Deshawn doesn't respond immediately. He studies Kyle, searching for sincerity. Finally, he says, "Sorry's a start, but it's not enough. What are you doing to make sure no one else goes through what I did?" Kyle nods, acknowledging the challenge. "I'm working on it. I'm listening, learning, and trying to change." The room exhales as the tension eases slightly. It's not forgiveness, but it's a beginning. Years later, Deshawn's nonprofit, Hidden Soldiers, becomes a national organization, working to reform policing and provide resources for marginalized communities. His story is taught in schools as a case study in activism and resilience. Kyle, too, finds a new purpose. He becomes an advocate for police reform, speaking at conferences about the dangers of unchecked bias and the need for accountability. Their paths, though forever intertwined, diverge. Deshawn continues to fight for systemic change, while Kyle works to rebuild the trust he once broke. The punch that started as an act of violence becomes a catalyst for a national reckoning. It forces America to confront its darkest truths, while offering a glimpse of what's possible when people choose empathy over division, accountability over denial, and action over complacency. The fight isn't over, but the story of Deshawn and Kyle reminds us that change, no matter how painful, is always possible. And perhaps, just perhaps, this punch truly did change everything. What do you think about Deshawn's story? How can we create a world where these injustices no longer happen? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. Your voice can be part of this conversation, part of this change. And if stories like this inspire you to think deeper, to act, or to learn more, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and push for the justice and equality the world so desperately needs. This is more than a story. It's a call to action. Be a part of it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Let's keep the fight for change alive.